Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Humana Healthy Horizons Training Summit. This particular session is called Changing ACEs Where You Are. ACEs, of course, stands for Early Childhood Experiences. And this session is being sponsored by the Circles of Care grant. And I will give you a little bit more information on the presenter shortly. Just a few virtual session reminders. You are being recorded. The session and the presentation is being recorded, and all attendees are placed on mute without video by default. This is a 2-hour session, and the presenter hopes to make it interactive. So at some time during the session, he will, ask questions and try to make it interactive. If you're having technical difficulties, please use the chat feature, and our Zoom engineer will try to get technical support and help from our team for you. Also, a reminder, I will be posting a link to the session evaluation. I will post it once I'm done with all of this housekeeping stuff, and I will post it perhaps again close to the end of the session. We're asking that you complete this evaluation. It's really important for us, for the presenters, and for us, Southern Plains Tribal Health Board as the organizers, to have your feedback and, just tell us, how we did. So this session, as I said, is called Changing ACEs Where You Are. And the presenter is Jeremy Elledge. Jeremy is the founder of Healing Solutions, and his team has lovingly nicknamed him The Force. He received his MSW from the University of Oklahoma in 2005 and is a licensed clinical social worker, full-time therapist, and mental health professional, clinical supervisor, and one of a limited number of trauma specialists in Oklahoma trained by the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. Jeremy is also a member of the Cherokee Nation, or citizen of the Cherokee Nation. Early work was in direct care for crisis stabilization for youth in acute and residential settings, and later he helped head up one of the first trauma grants in Oklahoma to help improve systems and services to be more trauma-informed and effective. Jeremy also directed implementation for the Sanctuary and START models for trauma-informed organizational culture and change, now working and supervising in outpatient therapy for kids and families. Jeremy enjoys teaching about the work, but his first passion and commitment is to do the work of helping injured populations heal. Jeremy is trained and certified as a professor and trained for the Sanctuary and SMART models, later going on to develop original training for continuing education of licensed mental health professionals. Jeremy taught parenting education for nearly 10 years, has been a proud employee of the Oklahoma Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services. He currently serves as lead trainer for the Evolution Foundation, heads up New View, and has a book coming out soon. Jeremy has overcome his own personal trauma in addition to losing much of his sight over the last decade. Yet this hardly slows him down. He has overcome many obstacles and has been known as one of Oklahoma's highly skilled and effective clinicians, a leader in the field of trauma and mental health. Our fearless leader truly embodies his own moving motto and mantra: don't let your obstacles become your excuses. Jeremy, thank you so much for consenting to do this session. And I will stop sharing my screen, pull up the slides, and we will get started. Welcome. Welcome everyone, and welcome Jeremy.
Thank you very much, Ms. Susan, and everybody for attending today. Are you guys hearing me okay?
Yes, we are.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I just wanted to make sure. It's always kind of hard to sit through and listen to my own introduction. I was over there squirming a little bit. So, but I'm super happy to be here with you guys today. I also want to thank Travis. He's kind of my, I'd say he's my right hand man, but he's on the left side, so he's my left hand man today. He is my eyes and my technical support today. So he will be prompting me on anything that I might forget about one of these slides. And so I am vision impaired, like she said, over the last 11 or 12 years. And so I have peripheral vision, but I can't see directly what I'm looking at. But I sometimes forget when I'm talking to a camera that I'm not talking to a real live audience. So it's just as well, because I feel pretty enthusiastic and passionate about what I have to share. So I won't read to you my slides, though. We're going to try to be very conversational, and I'm going to share with you what I've learned. And we are going to ask some questions. And since you guys, I think, will be muted, we'll ask.
Oops, I think we lost them. Hopefully we can get him back. I apologize for that. Something on his end.
I'm here.
Okay, great. Okay.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. We had a blackout there for a moment, so you
Okay.
can continue. Okay.
All right, very good. Travis, do we know what that might?
It's just because it's streaming through the camera and it keeps trying to go to sleep. I might just have to,
You might have to keep it awake.
yeah, I'll just.
Okay. All right. So yeah, the camera is apparently trying to go into sleep mode because we're not touching it actively enough. So Travis will have to touch it or something. So, but thanks again and welcome. We're gonna look at slide number 2 for the screen that Miss Susan will be sharing with you guys. And I just want to introduce you guys to my organization just really quickly. And so, because I'm really proud of the work that we're doing. We're in our 4th year now, and this has gone from a little idea to an actual thing now. And I'm really proud of that. Now, first and foremost, like Miss Susan said, I am a proud employee of the Oklahoma Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services, the ODMH SAS. And so I hope to always represent them well. I'm not on the clock today, so today I get to share a little bit about the side project that I do. I do work, though, in outpatient services with kids and with families. And so I am not a professional talker, which will probably be apparent as we get into today's discussion. But I do take great pride in being a doer of the work. And I know that there's a lot of people out there that like to come and share in their passions. And then others like to talk about things that they don't do. So I'm going to try to stay away from that. So I do therapy and working with kids and families and working towards recovery and healing. So I was part of one of the first trauma grants in Oklahoma. And so I got to help head that up, that project up. And so, and it was an amazing opportunity to get to learn from really smart people from all over. And so, and these over the years have become kind of puzzle pieces to a larger picture that I've been kind of coming into view with. But the grant ended some years ago, and the needs of our state are still great. Oklahoma, by some measures, is #1 in the nation in ACEs, #1 in the nation in family trauma, #1 in the nation in traumatizing children. And I'm an Okie. You know, I was born and raised in Oklahoma, and I will say that hurts my Okie pride. You know, because there's a lot of great things about Oklahoma. And of course, we also have to hear a lot about those things we're not so proud of as Oklahomans. And we've got a lot of resilience, but a lot of needs for change and for healing. So we wanted to make trauma-informed training that's real and affordable and accessible. We started before the pandemic a few years ago. We would take our resource to small communities. I'm from a small community, Nowata, Oklahoma, up in the northeastern part of the state. And we didn't have a lot of great training opportunities coming through. We usually had to go to Tulsa or Oklahoma City or to a university, and the needs are throughout. And so, and some of the training that people have to maintain their license is really costly. And we need to make information that help people very accessible. And so we've been really proud to be doing this for about 4 years now. And the clinical folks who get their continuing education with us support our resource to be free to anyone else in the community to learn about trauma. Because as we see, if we're number one in the nation in ACEs, then it's going to take more than just clinical professionals. It's going to take more than just counselors and teachers. It's going to take all safe adults to know and care about this. So part of changing ACEs where you are is also about getting more people excited and informed about this, because I know you guys believe in this. You guys are kind of the choir, I'm preaching to the choir, as they say. I know you guys believe in changing ACEs, and I hope to talk today some about how we can get other people involved in that process. So like I said, we're a CEU provider, but one of the things we're really proud of, we've been saying that we're offering free training to every single school system in Oklahoma for free. We're not trying to make money on our schools. We just want to help, because my kid goes to one of those schools, and some of y'all's kids goes to those schools. And so, and we're also offering to train every single law enforcement in the state of Oklahoma, no matter how long it takes. And we'll do that for free because our boys and girls in blue need some support, and they need some good information, because I believe a lot of our school workers and our law enforcement officers come in with great intentions, and then culture. A lot of times we learn some pretty negative practices and processes through culture. And sometimes trauma is an injury, and injured people can challenge our ethics and challenge our commitments and cause us to be reactive. So we're going to talk some more about that. But we've worked now with over a dozen school systems in Oklahoma, and we got our first law enforcement department. So we're like, what? Somebody's actually taking us up on it? All right. So spent a couple of days with the guys in Grove. Really enjoyed working with those. So anyway, we want to thank everybody who helps us do good things. And so we thank you guys for inviting us again, and also to the Evolution Foundation, to the Oklahoma Families Network, and all of our friends and collaborators all over the state, because it's going to take us all putting our heads together, because we've got a major challenge ahead. So we'll go ahead and move to that third slide. And this one's called Some Interesting History, if I remember. It's been quite a journey for us to come to even really understand what trauma is. If we don't understand what trauma is, we don't really understand what it does to people. So we know that trauma was first recognized among the veteran population. In our early wars, guys were coming back and were very affected by what they seen, what they'd experienced, what they'd suffered, the suffering they'd observed of others. And so now we didn't understand trauma very well. One of the symptoms of trauma in those days was an exaggerated startle response. So people were jumpy. They were startled easily. And so they developed a very basic understanding, because a hypervigilant response is part of it, but there's so much more layers to the injury of trauma. And so now it wasn't until women and kids started showing up with traumatic symptoms that we actually started to recognize that trauma actually didn't just come exclusively from war. It came from any number of experiences that were found to be traumatic. And so now I'll do a kind of a quick quiz question for you guys that you're going to join us on the chat box. Do you guys, there was a time that we didn't prohibit child abuse in the United States of America. And so for our fast fingers and our trivia winners, what was the law that we used to prosecute the first case of child abuse in the United States of America? So I'll pause for just to see if anybody gets that response. Travis, you can kind of keep an eye and let me know. Do we have the camera situation resolved where it's not going to go black on us? Or do we just have to keep checking it every now and then?
I'm just going to see if I can fix it.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, my own question. It was an animal protection law And so I don't recall the exact year, so somebody can also put that in the box if people are using the Google machine. But it was animal protection. We actually protected livestock in the United States of America before we protected children. And so, and similarly, we didn't used to protect women because women and wives were more, they had less rights and kind of considered more like property. And so if a woman brought herself or her children to the sheriff in the early days or to any kind of law enforcement and said, I'm being harmed, by our provider, please help us. You were usually sent back to your provider by an annoyed sheriff that says, can you believe what your woman's down here telling us? These were family matters to be handled at home. The community didn't want to really reckon with this quite yet. Now, there was a case so heinous that, again, somebody happened upon it somehow and said, you can't do that. We're calling the law. And the law said, nothing says in the book says they can't. So you were allowed to beat your children bloody. Nothing said you couldn't. And you were allowed to beat your wife too. You guys familiar with the rule of thumb?
Yeah, Crystal said it.
Okay. Way to go, Crystal. So it was the rule of thumb. And there's another quick trivia question for you. What was the rule of thumb? Because people use that in common interaction and language, but they don't always realize what they're referring to or the reference, where it comes from. Rule of thumb means it wasn't a law, but it was a legal precedent that a judge said, well, we're not going to say you can't beat your wife, but we're going to say because of the extensive harm that's being done, that's kind of a problem. So we're going to say you can't beat them with anything wider than your thumb. So ladies, you had to hope your guys had skinny fingers, and I joke a little bit facetiously about that, but that's not funny, because we know dangers out there in the world. We know danger exists on the television and in the next neighborhood and in another community, but it does a special kind of harm when we are not safe in our safe place, in our place where we're supposed to be able to get away from it all. And so, I think it's really, really important for us to come to understand the traumatic foundations of our nation and of our species as on the planet, a human, because America and most other nations had a pretty brutal history. So I'm a patriot. I'm not going to knock America and say we're bad, but we need to own the actions of our ancestors, because if we don't, then the impacts that have been lasting, continue to plague some of our populations. And so it's certainly a truth that we don't like to talk about, but the North American continent was owned and populated by Native American people. And so this continent was largely stolen from Native American people. Our Native ancestors were lied to, and treaties were broken again and again and again, and they were forced into smaller and smaller sections of the country that had less resources. The land wasn't as good. And we see some very real impacts of generational trauma that last to this day. Native American populations have among the highest suicide rates. And we see that humans are very adaptable. And when you are destroyed as a people for over generations, perhaps one of the impacts is that you adapt to start to destroy yourself. Injuries causing injured people to do injured things that cause more injuries. And of course, we know that much of the wealth of this nation was built on ownership of human beings. And so slavery, and again, I say we didn't do these things, but people were owned. And there was a whole, group of states that wanted to start their whole own country on the premise of being able to own people. And of course, African Americans were freed, but certainly not given equal citizenship. And while, many families that owned slaves continued to build their wealth and pass it down from generation to generation, those opportunities were not there for the African American community. We also know that gay, lesbian, and transgender people have been traditionally marginalized, abused, punished. And so we know a lot more. And this upsets some people when I talk about this, but we can look at a gay person's brain And we can look at a straight person's brain, and they're different in hormonal and structural function. And so I think that sometimes we get it wrong in some of our perceptions of those things being wrong when we don't understand. And we've also thought that fluid was a very black and white thing, but you can look at some of the studies of female athletes through Olympic history to find out that it's not black and white as far as chromosome, and some females do actually produce more testosterone such that it would technically categorize them as a male, though they were not born with any male parts. And so fluid is a bit, gender is a bit more fluid than we ever realized before. And so one of the things I think that we have to think about in the early foundations, a lot of our norms are passed from generation to generation in a time that's pre-logic. We do what's familiar. And so, and a lot of people have been hurt. There's been a lot of ACEs created because of some of these early dysfunctional foundations that keep creeping up in our lives today. Because child abuse is still happening, and domestic violence is still happening, and racism and bigotry, these are all still happening. And I think it's important to note, if somebody wants to join in the chat, who are some of the most influential people to early Americans and to this day? It was the doctor and it was the preacher. And so the doctor's book said being gay was wrong, and it was a morbidity. And now the doctor's book says different now because science has proven otherwise. But if the doctor and the good book both said, then it justified hate of a lot of people. It justified harm of a lot of people. Ownership of Black people, massacre of Native peoples. These were justified quoting the Bible. Man was given reign over the fowl, the bird of the air, the fish of the sea, and the beast of the field. And they said that Black people and Native people were not people. And they used this to justify the harm. And so, and I will point out too, I kind of get on a soapbox about this, but the people who fought in the Confederate Army usually didn't own slaves. They were people who were convinced of the righteousness of that cause and that Black people were not really people. And so anyway, there's a book by Judith Herman that highlights a bit better the history of how we came to understand trauma. And I highly recommend that book. It's called Trauma and Recovery by Judith Herman. And so we'll go on to the next slide. So this one is, I believe, Oklahoma's traumatic history. And so I think it's important for us to think, picking up from our little history lesson that we just had, Oklahoma, we're an injured, people. We're also very resilient. One of the things, other places in the country, when they have a disaster they're not accustomed to, when they deal with terrorism, when they're dealing with trauma, a lot of times they call us because we know how to deal with this stuff. We've had so much of it. So, of course, we know that Oklahoma was, started with the land run in the Trail of Tears. Those were, tragic parts of our history. And then we have the Tulsa Race Massacre, where the wealth of the Black community was stripped down. 1,256 homes, businesses, and structures were destroyed over, I forget however many city blocks. And again, destroyed by people who continued to pass their wealth on down to their offspring, and one of the things that really kills me about the Tulsa race riot, I'm from the Tulsa area. I graduated in Broken Arrow in 1997. 1997 was when they were actually allowed to start investigating this. Can you believe that? I can't believe that. But I can if you think about it, because 1921 is when it happened. And so if you do the math, we wanted to make sure some of them murdering grandpas were gone. And so, so again, that's a wicked part of our history that, we're just starting to uncover and learn more about. But we think as many as 300 people were killed just for trying to defend their homes and defend what later proved to be an innocent person. And so we've got the Oklahoma City bombing. We've got, some of the wickedest weather, on the planet. And that's normal to us. That's normal. You know, I got a kick out of it. I saw in the news, some people come to Oklahoma. There was an Australian couple that came here as tourists because they wanted to see where the film Twister had been shot. You know, so that's strange to us because that's just our fields. This is just where we live. But so the think about this is we are a strong people, we're an injured people, but there is some danger in being so injured and so many of us being that way because it creates a normalization. It creates an acceptance. That's just the way it is. And so, but we'll keep going and we'll look at the next slide. Travis, what do we got?
What is trauma? What is chronic stress?
Okay. Well, I think it's so important that we understand what trauma is and what trauma does. You know, I think we kind of understand the word, you know, and I'm not going to read the word to you. But, you know, emotions are these electrical and chemical impulses that happen in our brain. And no feeling is bad or wrong, but you can get too much of your own emotional and physical response to life. And so trauma is a real and measurable injury, but it changes our brain and our heart and our nervous system in really measurable ways. But we'll get into some of that in a minute. Now, trauma is something, if you had one trauma in your life, then you might recall it quite well if it was at a time where you could remember. A trauma, it creates usually a noticeable difference. If something runs me over, and then life's very different after that, then I noticed the change in where it came from. And now there is something called chronic stress or repeated and complex trauma, where trauma has happened so regularly or frequently that it's not a huge blip on the radar, that it has been kind of accepted within our system as normal. And this is kind of what happens. And so now chronic stress is not exactly the same. I put those there together. It has a very similar emotional and physiological response, impact on the body. But again, chronic stress can mean you just have a stressful job, or you had something that you were really worried about or thinking about for a while. And so, but, you know, our brain is use dependent. Our brain systems are use dependent. They grow and develop based on how they're stimulated, how they're activated, how they're used. And so some of the parts of our brain that deal with stress, fear, and pain have been overutilized. If I only work out my left arm and ignore my right arm, then this arm becomes overdeveloped. It becomes, it's bigger and stronger and more ready to work. In fact, sometimes if I do it too much, it might spasm and want to work on its own sometimes. And so that's what's happening. Trauma has left a lasting impression on our brain and our body that causes us to keep having those feelings after the event. And so go to the next slide, please. What do you got, Trav?
Real and measurable.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about the real and measurable injury of trauma. You know, when I was a kid, I did get hit by a truck on my motorcycle. I probably didn't have any business driving, and I was lucky, but it did break my leg, and I was very, very injured. And the doctors even told my family, cut him some slack, because, you know, if he lashes out, if he's emotional, whatever, that's to be expected with these types of injuries. I was very immobilized. I had bones sticking out of my body. I was immobilized. I was in a lot of pain. I just lost my starting job on the football team. So it was a real bummer in a lot of ways. Now, I didn't question why I felt bad. But when something changes our brain and our heart and our nervous system in measurable ways, kids don't walk around with brain scanners on and heart monitors. Their behaviors are injured. And we often judge and punish and criticize injured behavior because we think it's bad behavior. And so that's really, really important for us to understand, because we know we want to be nice and supportive and caring, but what about when that person lashes out and triggers some of our defense mechanisms and our emotional reactions? We've still got to be trauma informed then. And understanding and planning for those interactions is really key. We can look, trauma has often been treated as well, it's an emotional problem, but it's not an injury. Well, if something changes, if I can scan someone's brain and see that they've had too much development in certain parts of their brain, or disconnectivity among the different components of their brain, or if their heart is beating more times per minute, even in their sleep, or if their nervous system is more active in different ways, that's a measurable thing. When something happens to my body and changes my body in these vital ways, then that's a physical injury. It's also an emotional injury, and it's a social injury. And so, and I think it's really, really important for us to think about that. Kids that have extreme trauma before age 7 don't get as tall. Girls who have extreme trauma before age 7 tend to hit puberty earlier, and little boys later. Again, measurable impacts of an injury. But think about that. When the body is in crisis, when it's early in development, the body is literally having to prioritize and choose which development's okay, And so, but certainly extreme trauma does stunt development in different ways. And so now, I'm kind of a storyteller, if you guys hadn't noticed. So I'm going to try to be really brief with this story because I know we got a limited amount of time. But, I told you when I was a kid, hit by a truck, broke my leg. Some years later, I was walking behind the back of my truck that I still have, and I knocked into the tailgate on my shin right on the brake. And this was years ago that I broke my leg as a kid. And then as an adult, I ran into it. So anyway, it hurt really, really bad. And so I remembered that. After that, I was really careful. Deliberately, I went way around and I took huge steps over the tailgate because I made sure. And after a while, it came natural. I was taking huge steps and I wasn't even thinking about it. I was going way around it and I wasn't even thinking about it. And this is the way, I'll fast forward a little bit. I was riding the bus one day, and the bus driver, he shares with me, he thought he broke his leg recently. There was a lot of talk of broken legs. We were waiting on the bus, and a lady was trying to get on the bus. She said, "Thank you for waiting. I've got to go to the doctor. I've broken my leg." And she was running to catch the bus. So I was impressed on how well she was getting moving on that broken leg. But then Mike said, "Man, the other day I thought I broke my leg." When they said that, I started to feel warm in my body, and my leg started to ache from an injury years and years ago. But my brain started turning on it. When Mike said he hit his shin on a tailgate too, I remembered how I responded to that. And I thought, "Hey, Mike, did you go around the tailgate different after that?" And he said, "Oh yeah, I was really, really careful. I always go around it different now." And I thought, well, that's a human phenomenon then, because if it affects me in some weird way, then I'm just weird. But if it affects other people, that's a human phenomenon. Now, Mike and I, the bus driver, we both hurt ourselves on an inanimate object. We were clumsy, and I don't see well. Now, think about what happens when people hurt people, the social component, because sometimes it's not a tailgate that we're avoiding and stepping around. The measures that people take to stay away from those types of repeated harm are pretty extreme sometimes, and they don't always know that they're doing them. So, but anyway, those are some examples of the real and measurable injury of trauma. And so if I would have been, we often think, well, why can't they just get over it? Why can't they just, move beyond it? It would have been terrible if somebody said, "Jeremy, we expect you to walk as fast as everyone else, doesn't matter if you're injured." And so we need to understand a little bit more about brain development so we don't have those expectations. We'll go to that next slide, and I think I have scans of the brain there. Is that what there are, Travis?
Yes, but it's not.
I'm trying to move the computer. For some reason, it's not.
No worries. You maybe froze up.
Yeah. Okay, there we go.
Yeah, I'll keep going. There we go. So, and one of the important things, years ago, they gave me a business card and it said trauma specialist on it. And I thought that seemed pretty fancy. Oh, wow, that's great. Well, I have thought and specialized in trauma over the years, but I didn't do those brain scans, and I didn't I need you to understand that it's an injury, not because Jeremy said so, because this is science. And so we can point out in numerous ways the real and measurable injury of trauma. So I just wanted to spend a little time, because what you're seeing there is the brain that's not been affected by significant trauma. Now, I don't know if you can find a human being that has no trauma. If anybody in our audience today or anyone else has no trauma, high five. We don't want anyone to be traumatized, but we'd also kind of want to know what planet they're living on. Next.
Next
Mhm.
is the introduction to ACEs.
Okay. So we'll talk about ACEs a little bit now. And so do you guys, I want to ask first, because this study was not initially done with the intention of studying trauma. So for Fast Fingers and Trivia winners, who can tell us what we're actually studying? Not myself, but they were studying when they stumbled upon the ACEs. So I'll give 3, 2, 1 for Fast Fingers. Now I'm going to answer it. So this was actually a study done about weight and obesity and people that struggled with their eating and weight. And so this study was done by Dr. Vincent Felitti and the Kaiser Permanente and the CDC, and 17,000 medical records were studied from birth to death. And they found that and they identified these 10 different types of childhood trauma. But they found that the more adverse childhood trauma you have, the shorter your life is, along with a lot of other really awful outcomes. And so they started to break it down a little bit and see, though, what's happening, because everyone in the weight loss study, they successfully, tended to lose weight. Then when they got out of the program, they gained it back. So they asked them a lot of different psychological questions and asking about background, and the common denominator was childhood trauma. And so, again, we've identified trauma as an injury. And so injured people do injured things, and it's usually to try not to feel their feelings. Excuse me, I didn't mean to burp in your ear. But people develop addictive and compulsive behaviors. Let's go to the next slide, Travis. Okay, so these are the 10 ACEs. And by the way, I wanted to, if anyone would like a copy of today's presentation, I would like you to feel free to shoot us an email and we will just send it right on over to you, because information, if you find any of it helpful, we want to share by all means. And so, but there are the 10 ACEs. I don't have to read those to you, but the point is, these are family types of trauma. There's lots of different kinds of traumas that can affect humans, that can affect children, but these are family traumas that relate to the stability and the interactions with their caregiver. And so one of the things, when we're looking at the ACEs, kids can't prevent their own trauma. That's why we have to change ACEs from wherever we are. We have to do it for them, because they can't reach the pedals. They don't got gas money. They don't have the ability to solve their own problems, defend themselves from bigger people. They don't have the complexity of thought. They don't have money. There's all kinds of things that kids lack. Human beings are, I believe, have the longest period of caregiving among any species, because how long does it take for our trivia winners for the human brain to fully develop? How many years? It's not 18. That's when they want to recruit you to the military, so they can help finish your brain's development, I think. And I do appreciate our military people. So it's 25 years is how long it takes for our brain to be fully developed to kind of be able to even navigate this world. And so kids need lots of guidance and lots of protection, and they can't decide to go to a better community or a better house, or to love themselves and to teach themselves how to love themselves. We have to teach them that. And so we'll keep going. I get kind of passionate about this. I always try to start in a kind of monotone way, and by the end, I'm like patting my forehead like a Baptist minister, you know. What's next there, Trent? The pyramid. So let's break this down, and I think as we break it down, we see our points of interface and intervention, because these are outcomes that don't have to be true. And we can already see, you know, there'll be a number of us that have high ACEs. Many of us that come into this work were injured kids. In Oklahoma, it's highly likely, you know, that many of us have our own injuries that bring us and motivate us to this work. And so, but let's look at this a little bit. So at the bottom of the ACEs pyramid, you see the injuries. And so those are, you know, the things that are causing too much activity in a kid's brain, and causing the kid's body to prioritize. And it's causing these different avoidant mechanisms. You know, we'd use aggression, we use drugs, alcohol, all kinds of different things. Well, if a person has more headaches, they're going to take more Tylenol. And so we do see more addictive and compulsive problems developing because, you know, just like if I stick my hand on something hot, my reaction is to pull away from it. Well, our reaction is much the same to pull away from emotional pain. And so, but it's really, really important for us to understand. But let's work our way up the pyramid, because as kids are getting a little bit older, they're getting into adolescence, they're starting to smoke a little bit, and they're starting to drink a little bit, and they're starting to experiment with other substances and other risky behaviors. They're having sex earlier, and they're developing problematic peer groups. You know, injured people finding other injured people to be injured with and to do injured things together. And so we're going to see more academic problems, more social and emotional problems. We're going to see more weight and health problems. And you go on up, they're struggling with school, they're struggling with employment, they're struggling with relationships, they're having higher rates of all kinds of different health, legal, substance problems, higher rates of cancers and STDs, heart problems, and all this other, you know, incarceration and early death. Because this is something that happened to us when we're little. And it's not fair. You know, I remember Mom said once when I was a kid, I said, "That's not fair." She said, "Life ain't fair." I said, "Well, it ought to be." She said, "But it ain't." And I didn't understand. You know, my little mind had this concept of right and wrong. It ought to be fair, but it isn't. And so, but these outcomes don't have to be true. And so we have to, intervene as early as possible, as often as possible, and we need more adults to know and care about the ACEs. And one of the things I also want to remind you guys too, talking with people about ACEs is a good thing, but I think we have to be careful how we present this information. You know, if you have like 4 or more ACEs, you're thousands of % more likely to be an intravenous drug user, to name just one of many statistical likelihoods. But it's not a foregone conclusion. And we need to be able to present this from a place of, but look at your resilience, and how are we going to alter this? Because many will say, well, if that's where it's going to be, why not go ahead and just go down the path of injury? And so, but let's move on.
ACEs in Oklahoma, the unfun facts.
Yeah, the unfun facts. So again, I don't like to beat up on ourselves because I am a proud Okie, born and raised, Boomer Sooner. And so, and you know, if I could get a Boomer Sooner back from my live chat audience, so those who are so affiliated, I love that. If you're an Oklahoma State fan, that's okay. We love you too. If you're a Texas Longhorn fan, that's diagnosable. I am a professional. I can treat you for that. No, I'm just kidding. I got jokes. But looking at the outcomes of our injuries, being a highly injured state, Now, one thing I will say, I was tickled a little bit to hear the other day, because when I first started this, the Tulsa World had said Oklahoma's #1 in the nation for ACEs. Now, some measures have us at #3 now. So we're moving in the right direction. I don't think it's time to spike the ball just yet. But that's good news. That's good news. We need to move the needle. And I believe that people like you guys, people like us, we didn't do it, we didn't fix it, but we're part of the solution. We're contributing to good things. I really, truly believe that. In fact, we're always looking for people to help us teach what we teach. So if there's anyone there that wants to join us, we're just a ragtag bunch of people that wants to change Oklahoma for the better. So we would love to have you join us. But let's look at some of these injured outcomes. We're #1 in the nation also in heart disease death. And some of those obesity rates and weight problems. Again, we're thinking about how the ACEs was actually discovered. That's not a huge surprise. We're also #1 in the nation in incarcerating mommies, women. And in fact, actually, I'll back up. We're #1 in the world. Per capita for our population, we lock up more women than anywhere else in the world. And we are #2 for men, not to, and so now #2 in the nation for men. That's not a global statistic there. And so now, gosh, that looks bad on us, doesn't it? But I will say this, that does not reflect to me that we have more bad people in Oklahoma. We do have more injured people in Oklahoma, injured people doing injured things that cause further injuries for themselves, but also for their families and their communities. And so what else? From what I recall, we're #4 in cancer, #4 in divorce. Divorce is one of the ACEs. And divorce has become so normalized now. There's so many people that get together before their brain's done growing up. People who get divorced or married before age 25 are so much more likely to get divorced. But also, let's look at some other painful facts. Now, I think Big Business Stit has moved the needle on these a little bit, but 46th in the nation in spending for education per student. 46th, and 46th in the nation on spending for mental health. I think that is changing a little bit. I think we are getting a little bit of progress. So I have not been able to find the proper stat on that, but it's still not good. And I won't get political with you, but we're getting what we pay for. We are getting what we pay for. So Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, teacup parties, I don't care. We've got to put people in there who's going to support our kids. All that other stuff aside, I had the privilege a couple of years ago of getting to speak after a congressman. I won't say who it was, but I'll tell you what, I'm tired. I'm tired of people from big business coming out and, running for office, and so they can do good for their industry. And then they come out and they cut ribbon at ceremonies and say pretty words and then crap on Oklahoma families. And it's just not okay. But we're getting what we pay for. We're treating politics like it's our favorite team and not picking who's best. So that's all I'll say about that. But we've got to do better. We've got to do better. What's next? Family and generational trauma. So generational trauma is a very real thing. I'm going to talk about it just a little bit here. And I actually have a presentation coming up next month where we're going to spend quite a bit more time on that. So again, email us if you want information on that. Our videos, we have several of them up on our website, and they're free viewing anytime. So check that out. But think about family and generational trauma for a little bit. Trauma that's generational, because we go back to the whole debate, nature versus nurture. Well, I think certainly it's some of both. When our grandparents are injured, then they can parent our parents injured. And so there is direct trauma and vicarious trauma when we see loved ones injured and then are injured by them. And so it creates a very normalized pattern of trauma. And it often creates trauma that's usually repeated and early and often. You know, I had a kid I was doing a trauma assessment with. I did, during that trauma grant, I assessed over 2,000 children for trauma and had a lot of bad dreams about it, honestly. But this one kid said he didn't have no trauma. I said, all right. And he didn't want to do the assessment. I said, oh, it's okay. Fine. Let's just play a game of pool and visit for a little while. He said, am I going to get in trouble? Am I going to get a refuse? I said, no. If you don't want to talk about it, you don't have to. You don't have to tell me nothing you don't want to talk about. And then he told me everything. So, and of course, his life had been such layered, repeated trauma. That's where you see that complex trauma when it doesn't create a blip on the radar. It was so normalized for him. And so, you know, I remember talking to another kid that had trauma on top of trauma on top of trauma. And I asked him, hey, man, what are you going to do when you grow up? He said, probably go to jail. And I'd heard that response again and again. I was like, I'm probably going to end up in jail or something. It's like, well, why would you shoot for that? That doesn't sound, well, that's just what we do in my family. And indeed, looking at some of the files and the backgrounds, and yeah, and what a tragic familiarity, what a detrimental familiarity that is. And so, but anyway, I was going to tell you guys about a study. There was a study done of mice. And there's lots of different studies done of mice that I'll refer to in some of the different training I do. And it's not good. I'm not a big proponent of hurting mice, but we still hurt people so much that I'll have to bleed my heart for the mice later once we're done hurting each other. Because, you know, human beings, we used to be kind of have to worry about predators on the planet and stuff. We have no natural predators now. So the main source of trauma for people is people. And so, train of thought. What am I on? Family and generational trauma. The mice. So the train of thought does get derailed every now and then. So, but they took male mice and they shocked them and then exposed them to a cherry blossom. Shock them, cherry, shock them, cherry, shock them, cherry. So, you know, after a while, you didn't even have to shock them. Just show them a cherry, the cherry smell, and they demonstrated visible fear. They had actually been traumatized. They had little mouse ulcers and different things. So they were traumatized by this process. And so then these mice got to have babies, you know, at least let them have babies if you're, you know, so, but for 3 generations, the male pups, when exposed to a cherry blossom, they demonstrated visible fear of it, and they were never shocked. And think about that for a second. We use mice in a lot of these studies because their nervous system is quite similar to ours. And so it's not ethical for us to hurt humans and then let them smell stuff. And then so we can't really do this in a lab with people. But think about it. You know, it is possible that we could have emotional reactions to things that are beyond our consciousness. We've always known that babies can have trauma, but they can't always remember. So some generalized anxiety may come from baby trauma or from grandpa's trauma. And so now one of the things that it makes me kind of think about too, is again, our African-American and our Native populations, because it wasn't a cherry blossom that they were being harmed to, but there were probably other associations. And so I've heard some Caucasian people say, well, but Black people don't like us, or, you know, there's the reverse racism or whatever. There is such thing as reverse racism, I think, but also I feel like there's such a thing as hypervigilance. And some of that may be because of the lack of safety generationally. And so now they looked at those mice DNA, and they did find that there was no alteration to the DNA. This is through a process of gene expression. And so, and there's other things, looking up studies on epigenetics and different things. There was another study of little mice And so the mice that were allowed to stay with their mothers for a week and be groomed and cared for by their mother had way better life outcomes and handled stress much better, as opposed to those that didn't have the nurturance of mother for that first week of life. They had much higher mouse anxiety and lower functionality. Isn't that interesting? So anyway, some of these mice studies, they offer some insight, but I think they sometimes give me as many questions as answers. But I think, there is a harm that can come with normalized trauma, but also through the fact that, when the body is stressed, I think we know that mother can pass stress along to baby. And so there's a lot there that we're just beginning, I think, to understand about this generational trauma stuff. But also, if, going back to the Tulsa race massacre and how many families and child ACEs that were started by that event. Because for those of you that are familiar with the Tulsa area, it was called Black Wall Street. It's North Tulsa now, and for any of you who've ever spent much time in North Tulsa, it's been a very challenged community, plagued by poverty and crime. And so, but any community of people, when there's not enough resources to exist within that community, we're going to see violence. We're going to see crime. We're going to see dysfunction. So, next, please.
Unmet needs.
Unmet needs. So, are there injured behavior, injured relationships?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Creating.
Yeah. Okay. So emotional needs are real. You guys remember the guy that had the hierarchy of needs? Somebody's going to probably type it in there. Extra brownie points for the person who remembers. But the hierarchy of needs. Mr. Abraham Maslow gave us another pyramid, and he talks about on the bottom is food, shelter, and clothing, and protection for kids, and those basic needs. And then you move on up the pyramid a little bit, and then you've got love and acceptance and feeling a sense of value and being able to have a sense of acceptance within your family first, and then later with a peer group. These are really important needs. We teach kids how to feel about themselves. And so bad things happen when these needs for both provision and basics, as well as emotional needs, are not met. And so I used to teach parenting classes, and the lady I taught with, she said, when your kid walks into the room, your eyes are supposed to light up. You're supposed to be happy to see them. And I think that that's really important, because they get to a certain age and other people's eyes light up. And it's a new feeling. Wow. Somebody is interested in me. And so, but we can see among young males that are with unmet needs at home, they're going to have higher rates of problematic peer groups. They're going to be more gang involvement, risky behavior, because injured kids getting together and doing injured things together. It kind of, it's, I don't know if the right word is ironic, but kids are learning a lot from one another in adolescence, and none of them really quite have it figured out yet, but they're sure teaching each other a lot. And so, so the gangs, we see earlier and more frequent sexual relationships for little girls that don't have their needs met at home. And indeed, they're more likely to leave home early and find a guy that's a little older and got his own place and more established. So get away from the trauma of home, and often steps right into another kind of trauma where there's an unequal power dynamic. And again, when we come from traumatic places within our families, sometimes, as somebody said, our picker is broke a little bit. So we if we've been raised in unsafe or dysfunctional situations, sometimes it kind of impacts our sense of who is safe and safe dynamics or characteristics. But thinking about this, we know we don't want kids to get into trouble and get into problematic peer groups and gangs and everything. But also people who take the hard line, the Nancy Reagan just say no approach, they're not understanding the problem. I had a lady on the bus driver, but bus told me just this morning, asked me what my opinion was about if homeless people are made to feel too comfortable, if we're rewarding people for being homeless. And so I think that there's just too much of a punitive approach. I think people ask you your opinion on such things so they can tell you theirs, because that's certainly what she did. And so many people, even in the homeless population, I worked in group homes for years, kids aged 12 to 19 that had such gross and significant trauma in their first years that they'll never be okay. If they ever are out of a facility, they will be vulnerable, victimized, and homeless. And so those are the people that we often judge, because with our functional brains and our functional norms, we ought to project those norms and those values and beliefs onto other people. Like the song says, then you really might not know what it's like. I think I quoted the song wrong. But telling kids to just don't do those things. For instance, the kids that are in gangs, a lot of them don't have a family member at home, or maybe have one and may have a little bit of food, or they may have an addicted or mentally ill parent. They may have an abusive home. And so going with the gang is where they get their social acceptance. The big homie who breaks them off is the one that also has some of those provisional needs met. And so it is safer to be in numbers in the community. And so provisional and emotional needs are sometimes being met, albeit dysfunctionally within some of these dynamics and relationships. But we've got to, I think, respect how these needs have been met and try to help kids meet needs in better, healthier ways. Because if you just tell a kid to get out the gang, and the gang's been the only way they've been able to survive to their adolescence, then you're not speaking a language that they can comprehend. You're not being relatable with that child. And so what's next?
Is the do no camp for kids.
Okay. Yeah. So like I said, I get kind of passionate, kind of enthusiastic about this. And I kind of joke that what I lack in intelligence, I'll make up for with enthusiasm. But it's an existential crisis. I really do feel like, some of the biggest problem makers in our world needed a few more hugs, I think. And that can be people who have committed atrocities, from any walk of life. Some of our world leaders needed a few more hugs and different things. And so, but I do think sometimes resources do hide injuries a little bit. We know that communities that are struggling with poverty, are going to have high rates of other trauma and chronic stress. And that's sometimes a noticeable type of injured behavior. But sometimes the kids that got everything that you could ever want materially don't have a parent to make them feel special. Those are the kids that we think, they've got everything. Their life is great. But if they're not taught to love themselves by the people who love them, then they can still struggle in their ways as well. And so inequality, though, it's creating a significant crisis. This guy asked me in a parenting class once, said what business it was of mine, how he raised his kid. I said, well, your kid might come and hurt somebody else's child, and indeed they had. So it was our business. It is our business. We've lost our sense of community, I feel like, in some instances. And as long as it's somebody else's kids, we don't care. But I will say, if we were looking at our society on a bar graph or a chart or a mathematical equation, we see where this is going. Our society's in trouble. I really do see that. I believe that. And some of the different social problems that we're having, are the symptom, because, we say, it's ethical, it's humane, it's moral to care for and make sure and provide and protect for all children. And I believe that every person viewing this here today means that and values that with me. But as a society, we don't. We do not. and the crumbling of our society is a byproduct of the fact that we allow for inequality among children. You know, a lot of I don't want my tax dollars to go to that school over there. You know, but it's not like those kids are, you know, any less deserving of a quality education or the resources for that. So society, again, is only as strong as its weakest link, and we're producing a lot of weak links, and the chain is breaking. So anyway, I'm getting preachery on you guys, and again, I know you guys believe and buy into this with me, but we got to get more caring adults to know and care about this. What's next? Okay, try to play it. See if it'll work. I want to try to play you a word that is not from our sponsor. And if it doesn't work, I'll just tell you about it.
Mom!
Yeah?
I fell.
Okay, there's bandages in the cabinet.
I'm bleeding.
Grab 2.
Sheba, what cats want.
Okay. Get it back. Were you guys able to see that?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Okay. Nothing wrong with using a little humor. I'm not endorsing Sheba. I'm sure they have fine feline products. But I kind of don't like humor that trivializes or minimizes the role that we have for caring for children. You know, and one of the things too, people in the substance abuse treatment and recovery community will tell you that we make light of substance abuse way too much, you know, and it's always the party thing and everything. In a lot of movies, it's funny and to get wasted and everything else. They never really show, it's not very Hollywoody. It doesn't sell movies or put butts in the seats to show you the real outcomes of that. You don't see very many recovery movies, you know, or addiction movies. And so, but like I said, you know, I do have a sense of humor. I'm not trying to be somebody who's just dry and doesn't have anything's funny. But TV is a very influential medium. It really, really is. Your catchphrases, the way we talk and think, some of that is influenced highly by television. And so anything that makes a parent think it's okay to just sit around and not care about their kids' hurt, you know, is problematic to me. And so that was an actress, whatever, on that, you know, commercial there. But don't think for one second that there aren't people who are very disengaged with their parenting. And sometimes, if you go to that next slide, the one on passive parenting, active harm. And so you can see, you know, some people do think it's funny to ignore the kids, you know, and I will remind that, you know, kids have emotional needs. And just like anything, if those needs go unmet long enough, those needs and start to diminish, and along with them, some of those capacities. You know, if you have emotional pain long enough, it starts to become emotional numbness. And so, and then of course, they're also gravitating towards other people and other vulnerable situations. There's all kinds of people out there ready to prey on our kids, and they are looking for those vulnerable ones. And so now parents have their injuries, and I want to help address that because I'm starting a parenting class, and we're going to try to make that statewide, and it's called Healing Injured Parenting. Because so many of the parents, I don't want to bash them over the head. I want to help them forgive themselves for growing up injured and parenting injured. But one of the things that I just have to remind folks is, you know, kids have less ability to meet their own needs. So you've got to have your adult time and your self-care and, you know, go do for the adults, but also kids have less means. And so we've got to prioritize for those needs first. And of course, we know that our society, there's lots of people making babies that are just not quite ready to care for babies. But so we've got to help heal injured parenting in our state. and see that if we're disengaged and we're passive, then we're harming our children. And so, sometimes it takes a lot to hurt a kid, and sometimes it don't take much at all. Sometimes, traumatizing a kid requires no effort at all. And so anyway, that's my soapbox about passive parenting and active harm. Pardon me. What time is it?
It's 2:13.
Okay, I would like to stop right now and see if there's any questions, comments, rotten eggs you'd like to throw at me. I'll try to look to the chat box and see if there's anything that you guys would like me to try to specifically address. Plus, it's after lunch, so we got to make sure everybody's awake. So keep our brains highway a two-way street.
Thank you, Jeremy. Let me, Idalmi, do you see any? I am in share screen mode, so I can't see if there are any questions or comments.
Okay, Travis will check that for us. You can just stick with the screen you've got if that's better.
Okay.
Okay, we are going to change out our microphone batteries right quickly, just to make sure that we don't have any disruptions for the home stretch.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
As we are waiting and to see if any comments or questions come in, I just want to remind you to fill out the evaluation. It was posted in the chat, and we will post it again. And we're asking you to please take some time to fill that out at the conclusion of this session. Will be helpful for the presenter and for us.
Absolutely. And if anyone has a question or comment that they'd like to take to us directly, you can certainly just email us and we'll do our best to respond to that quickly. Not during the presentation, of course, but if there's a question or concern or something trauma-informed or something, feedback you have for me, certainly welcome that. So did you see any comments or questions, Travis? If not, we're going to roll.
We're good. No.
Okay. All right. Very good. As long as they're awake. So, what's next?
Okay, hold on. Let me get back to the share screen mode.
Okay.
Should be
All right.
Systems of care needing care.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Again, when I first got into mental health treatment, I was, green, as they say. I was bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and I remember, I was doing something that I'd been trained to do. It was a pretty menial task, and a guy who'd worked there for 30 years said, "You don't have to do that, kid. That's too much work." And I said, "Well, sir, I just got out of my orientation, and it said I have to do this." And he said, "Yeah." He goes, "Well, that's more work, for you if you want me to go, but this is how it really goes on the unit." That's culture. We have pretty words on policies and procedures in all of these systems, but we don't always abide by those. And so, again, teachers, my hats are off to people who I have to deal with kids one or two at a time, dealing with whole rooms full of them and trying to create some order and education in that. Wow. And again, knowing how injured our student populations are, especially now after COVID, they've got quite a task. But one of the things that the outcome is still there. We're failing to engage a lot of the most at-risk and injured kids. The kids that are acting up, we'll suspend them. We'll expel them. We'll get them out of there. Or the one that sits back in the back of the class and tunes out and puts his head down. A lot of times we're just letting that kid go because it's easier. But I think we have to really look at our systems and help our teachers better understand how to engage traumatized kids, because they want to help and then they're cussed out by a kid and then their feelings are hurt and they're stressed out and their heart's beating hard, and then they're interacting based on their reactions better rather than their emotional intelligence and what's best for the kid. So many interactions end up coming as a result of the strong emotions provoked rather than what's best for that person in need. of the service. And so, so again, that's with schools, and also law enforcement. Is militarized. I really have my, a lot of respect for the men and women of law enforcement, but they're suited up like commandos. And if you dress somebody for war, they're going to be mentally prepared for war. And I saw a video, officers are trained to think that every member of the community could possibly kill them, at any time. And so they're very reactive and very sensitive. That's a very injured group of guys. And so it's much harder to fill police spots these days. It's much harder to hire police. But one thing that I have to remind is, I think we have to be willing to examine ourselves and be open to change. I am not a defund the police kind of guy, but I am all about reallocating some resources to go to mental health, because some of the people that law enforcement is interacting with are mentally ill and they need a crisis intervention. And then they need a facility to go to, and we're really lacking on those. But I had a guy come into my office once with a gun, and he was psychotic, and he said he meant to do harm. And it was a pretty scary event. And using communication skills, verbal de-escalation, I had the gun in my hand before the police got there. And if they'd have gotten there and the gun wasn't in my hand, what do you think would have happened? He wouldn't have got to go to the hospital and get back on his meds. He'd have got to go to the morgue. And so I say this kind of jokingly, but, arm the police and prepare them for the job by all means, but put them in some Hawaiian shirts or something. Quit dressing them like the Grim Reaper, all in black and military fatigues, and remind about communication, which we're going to talk about here in a little bit. But I found that an average of 8 hours is spent training police officers on verbal de-escalation and psychology, and 129 hours are spent on average training with our gun. And undoubtedly a dangerous weapon to be respected, and we need to know how to use it very well, very familiarly. But think about that, though. 8 hours versus 130 hours, we're going to reach for whatever we practice with the most. And the most powerful thing we have about our humanity is our brain and our heart. We get tough when we need to, but we're not employing these resources fully yet. And so anyway, mental health, that's kind of my area. And so we've got more mental health dollars coming into our state right now, so we've got a great opportunity. Or we could build beautiful new buildings and do the same old things within those four walls. And so it's really important for us to become trauma-informed truly in the way that we practice. I worked at a children's hospital, and early on in the time that I was there, a child successfully ended their life in our facility. They were carried out dead. We were supposed to have eyes on them every 15 minutes. And the new staff who was checking on the kid every 15 minutes was told by an old staff, "You don't got to do that. They're asleep. Just mark them down." It's culture. Sometimes it is life or death. And so doing trauma training, that's just trauma a bunch of times and checking the box to meet a mandate so we can say we covered it, that's a poor excuse. It's unethical, it's immoral, and it's wrong. And so we got involved with the trauma grant because kids were being thrown down and physically brutalized, and put in holds way more often than they needed to be. Now, physical intervention is necessary sometimes, but it's done as a last resort. And the way we interact with kids in the before, during, and after moments has everything to do with whether those escalations are actually going to happen or not. Mental health technicians need to have more training, more support, more pay, and need to be empowered and trained and treated like mental health professionals, because that's what they are. But a lot of them view their job as a babysitter. They're sitting back doing their crossword and waiting for the kids to interact, and then to say, "Get down from there, get off of her, leave that alone." And so we have to be interacting And certainly for kids that have been physically, sexually, emotionally abused, we got to keep our hands and our bodies off of them at all, whenever possible. We had a kid, he would hit us and hurt us. He was a big kid and he had big old heavy hands and he'd break your jaw. I mean, he'd hurt you. And, but he was also a very injured little boy. And so, long story short, I remember we had to hold him and he hit staff and that staff was so patient with him. I was so pleased and proud because we were not going to punish kids for the reasons they came to treatment. And so he kept asking him, hey, can we let you up? Are you okay? Are you breathing okay? And the kid, was just gnashing his teeth and spitting and, carrying on. And sometime later, he started getting better. And I asked him how and why and what's better for him. He said, well, that's when I knew y'all cared. I said, what do you mean? He says, when you wouldn't do it back. So a lot of kids are engaged in a very dysfunctional dance. And it's a subconscious thing, but a lot of times they're provoking strong emotions from us and provoking us to play in the role and doing that part, because a lot of kids see adults as bad and scary and wrong. And if they can provoke us into that role, then it preserves their worldview and they don't have to look at anything differently. And so it's really important for us to think about. I remember, I won't say the bad words that were said, but I remember another one of my first experiences on the unit. I was doing a one-to-one, and I was green, so I had to shadow a staff who was doing the one-to-one. And for those of you who know, one patient, one staff. That's a high level of care when they're really struggling. And this little girl had been brought in after an attempted suicide and an overdose. And of course, she was brought in handcuffs like you do injured children. And she slept for a really long time. And then the
Sorry for the loss in connection. I'm sure that he'll be back shortly.
All good.
Is it?
Okay.
Is
Okay,
it?
you're
Okay.
back.
Okay. All right. Maybe the camera went to sleep on us again. We'll try to have that resolved before we ever do this again. But okay. Train of thought. Oh yeah, the little girl. So we went in and we woke the little girl up and she didn't want her cereal. And first my training staff was very nice and sweet and said, well, honey, I didn't wake up before the other kids come back to the unit so you can get cleaned up. You'll feel better. And I was like, I was all about trying to help kids feel better. I wasn't happy that another child was injured and struggling, but I wanted to help. It was my first opportunity to get to try and help. And eventually, the little girl didn't want to. She finally yelled at us, told us to leave her alone and said some words. And I'll tell you, I'll just be honest, I had my feelings hurt because I don't know what I was thinking, show my naivete, but I really believe that if we went and offered kindness to an injured child, they would immediately reciprocate with obedience and gratitude. And how wrong I was, but also how shocked I was at how my trainer staff reacted. Because she threatened the little girl and threatened to throw her in the floor and called her a nasty name. Threatened to take her down and that she was going to hit the floor. An injured child. And so one of the things that we have to do to be emotionally intelligent is we have to understand that the 2 seconds of interaction has more to do with their injuries, not who we are. It's not personal. We're just the person that came to wake them up, the person that's got keys, the person that has authority over them in a place they don't want to be. And we have to understand that. And so it's not about our respect, by golly, you show me, that's not what it's about. Those kind of people need to be educated or assisted to other employment, and that person was. So what's next?
Is the therapy relationship.
Okay, so I'm going to start. I'm going to kind of just spend just a very tiny little bit of time on this because we've got some other stuff I want to try and get to. But therapeutic relationship, it's not just for therapists, by the way. Now, I don't want everybody to go out and start trying to do therapy if they're not qualified to do so. But therapeutic the term therapeutic, many people can be therapeutic, and any safe adult. And so one of the things, we start getting years and experience and fancy letters behind our name, we start feeling pretty fancy. But I am reminded, Scott Miller did a study about therapeutic relationship, and the study found that therapeutic relationship had more to do with treatment outcomes than the longevity or experience of the clinician. Either they've been in the business 2 years or 20 years, people were getting better more based on the relationship with the patient, with the child, with the consumer. I don't like calling them consumers, but that's what they call them, I guess. But outcomes are, tied to what we invest in kids. What's the last bullet on there, Travis?
Outcomes connected to.
Okay, I said that, huh? So what's the third bullet?
Kids don't care what you know.
Yeah. Yeah, kids don't care what you know till they know that you care. I love that quote. It's not mine, but I say it, and it works. And that's true of people, but especially kids. And honestly, there's a lot of kids who know their teacher don't like them, who know that adults in their life don't like them. Kids are sharper than we give them credit for. We'll talk about communication a little bit. Up to 85% of communication is nonverbal, and doggies know who don't like them, and certainly kids do as well. What's next?
Next slide.
We're going to pass this slide and go to the next slide. Yeah, so I spend quite a lot of time talking about emotional intelligence. And so we need our society, we need our adults, we need our kids to learn this concept. And so, I would love to hear what people want to type in what does this mean to be emotionally intelligent? So feel free to share your best definition of emotional intelligence, what that means to you. I tell kids, really, that sounds fancy, but you know what emotions are, right? You know what intelligence is, right? Put them together. We're going to be more intelligent about our emotions. We're going to be smarter about our feelings. And to do so, I think that we have to kind of think about our brain a little bit. Many have talked about emotional intelligence, and so this is not something I didn't originate the term, but I expanded upon it, I think. And so we have a limbic system, that's our emotional brain, and we have a cerebral cortex, that's our smart brain. And those are separate structures and functions in the brain. And that's we know what it's like to feel one way and then know what we ought to do, and it's different. So our brain often does what I would call the cognitive tug of war. And so, but it's important for us to understand our feelings. When I stop and think for a second, how do I feel right now? Then what I'm actually doing is I'm using my cerebral cortex to look down into my brain at the limbic system and see what it's doing. And if I'm more aware of how I feel and why I feel that way, then I am less likely to let my feelings out in ways that we don't want them to come out. I had a guy tell me he didn't want to talk about feelings. We don't talk about feelings. That's not what men do. I said, that's fine. I said, but can we talk about the electrical impulses that are happening in your brain? Because, they're happening whether you talk about them or not. And so if we need to be aware that those electrical responses get stronger and stronger and stronger, and they will come out of us in ways that we do not want them to come out if we're not aware of them and making some choices about them. Again, I say no feelings are bad or wrong, but sometimes what we learn to do with those can be. And so, I would say that, a baby's brain is like a brand new iPhone with no apps or data used yet. And so each new experience encodes data on that brain. And so a little baby looks around with eyes and ears, and they're seeing other people and what they do, how their feelings look and sound. And that's data. And that's familiarity. That's norm. That's creating instinct. If our brain's like a cookie jar, everybody else is supplying the cognitive cookies. And we can only reach into that brain's jar and pull out the cognitive cookies that were placed within it. And yet, once we get to a certain time in our life, we can become aware we can increase our own consciousness, and we can start to make some of our own cookies. We start to absorb data that's of our choosing. We cannot rewind or erase trauma from our brain and our neurology, but we can give ourselves new development, new data, and we can be mindful and conscious in choosing to access those new instincts, those new data. And so we're not stuck with the injured and traumatized brain that we have. But it requires emotional intelligence. I put emotions into 4 different categories. I've got a book coming out one of these days, and these are just my observations. It's a gross oversimplification, but the point is to get people to thinking about why they have feelings. Now, anger and sadness are not wrong. They're not bad. We need them. Some of the most unpleasant emotions we have are key to our survival. So anger and sadness are negative motivators. They motivate us for change, to address something, a need or a problem. Fear and stress responses actually speed our brain up. So I call those reactor emotions. When you're scared, if we're running away from a predator, you're not thinking, I wonder if my new show's coming out on Netflix. You're not even thinking in words. You're thinking in actions. And it's a good thing that our brain actually speeds up. It's like a slow motion photography. A slow motion photography lens is actually, the camera's working faster to show you a slower image. Our brain is working faster to help us react quickly and instinctively to a threat or a perceived threat. So that's a good thing that we need that capacity. But again, we know our brain's like a muscle. If we experience that too intensely or too often, it does harm us, and it does leave a lasting impression on our mind and on our body. Happy and joy, love, pride, these things that supply us with dopamine. These are what I call the positive motivators, the positive reinforcers. This make us want to do more of things that have had a positive or pleasant outcome. Now, one thing that we have to worry about, I had heard Anna Lemke, a neurologist, I think out of Stanford. She was talking about the pleasure-pain balance. People who have more pain are going to gravitate towards more pleasure or more relief. And so this is where we see that trauma and these types of injuries increase the risk for addiction, both to substances as well as other behaviors that supply that dopamine response. We used to think that you couldn't be addicted to something that didn't introduce a new substance into your body, but now we know that we can become addicted to the way that our body responds to a stimulus, such as video games or gambling or shopping or eating or any number of things if done excessively. So, but there's a ton that we could say about emotional intelligence. But one of the things that I like to do for an exercise of emotional intelligence in therapy, group, family, or individual is say what our feelings are, what our goals are for those feelings, and who we ask for help. Because this allows us to slow down. So many people don't recognize their feelings until they've already felt them and acted upon them. And so we want to slow a reaction down to a decision. Here's how I feel, and here's what I want to do about it. And we have to help kids and families understand that so many, I joke with families, I said, now hopefully you guys have never had any negative influences and you've only watched Mr. Rogers on television. And then I again wonder what planet. The likelihood is that we have all learned some negative ways of expressing and coping with our feelings. And so if we help people recognize what feelings are for, sometimes we've learned bad ways to handle our anger or our sadness or our fear and stress or our joy, and reminder emotions are things like regret, shame, guilt, embarrassment, things that our brain takes a note of. So we try not to repeat that outcome. And now one thing I will say though, shame is what I would call a reminder emotion, but society helps us with our shame. If trauma is an injury and injured behaviors are considered to be bad behaviors, I feel like the problem is really compounded by the judgment, the punishment, the criticism. We make people feel worse about their injuries. But there's a lot we can say about emotional intelligence, but we want to be smarter about our feelings and use them for what they're for. I just want to say one other thing. My doggies, they help me understand emotional intelligence a little bit more. When they get excited, a dog gets excited, the part of their body that reflects that is their tail. It starts really wagging, And so if somebody knocks on the door and I've got a can of soda on the table by the door, it's going down. And so he hears me talk about him. So he's tap dancing in here, I think. But so now my dogs don't have the capacity to say, Daddy doesn't like it when I wag my tail and have this emotional behavioral response. So I'm going to manage that. I'm going to do it differently. Dogs have small brains. Now, humans have approximately 16 billion neurons in our cerebral cortex. That's a big brain. And pound for pound, that's the biggest brain in the universe. Now, whales and gorillas have bigger in some respect, but not in pound for pound cortex. Human beings are the only animal that thinks about thinking. We think about thinking, so we can recognize our tendencies. We recognize when we do that thing that we do, whatever that thing is. And we can come to recognize problematic behaviors. We can plan for them, and we can anticipate them, and we can change them. We are not stuck with the injured brains that we have. We have the ability to influence ongoing development in our brain based on what we do. And so that's pretty neat but I feel like a lot of people are using their limbic system like a dog wags its tail. I don't think my dogs know they have a tail, so they don't know it's doing stuff. And a lot of people don't know how they have a limbic system, but it's still doing stuff. And we can be in more control of that. So next, Travis.
Next is family focus program.
Again, I'm talking about generational trauma next month, and y'all feel free to tune in for that. But one of the things I think as clinicians, we forget that we are professionals and we do get to make recommendations. They may not follow them, but at my orientation with all kids working with families, I present from the very beginning before they demonstrate much problem. I want to tell them all kids need lots of family therapy. The statistical likelihood of their success and recovery hinges on family participation. Therapy is not magic. In an hour a week, we can't change the world. And I'll tell them, they'll keep billing your insurance, sure, but you're telling us you want these outcomes. You want your kid to get better. I'm telling you, it ain't going to happen if you don't help us address some of the environmental stressors and help them practice their skills. My daughter took violin. She took violin lessons once a week. She never practiced. And so she wasn't very good at playing violin. Therapy is the lesson of learning new skills. Home is where we practice those skills. And so parents have to know at least the things that we're talking about strategy-wise. They can't know the confidential stuff, but we can empower that role. And we have to help parents examine some of their own parenting instincts and norms, how they came to parent as they do. And a lot of parents say, I was parented that way and I'm just fine. Well, just fine is certainly a subjective opinion, but the resilience that we do find is often despite some of the hardships we encountered in childhood, not because of them. But I tie outcomes to family therapy. And so, and I really want to recommend that hard. Because so many of our families will boot the kid out at the curb. Here, go do your therapy. Now, improving outcomes means families healing together, and it helps to reduce some of that stigma too about you being the one that needs counseling. No, families need to get well. So, and I, again, got a whole training about that. You can email us or check us out at newviewhealingsolutions.org for more information there. Next, Travis.
Trauma-informed communication.
Okay, this is really important. And again, not to keep plugging us, but this is one of the most important trainings that we do. Is trauma-informed communication, our human tools. And so I feel like we get out there further and further in our complexity of theory and practice, and that's great, but we're forgetting some of the fundamentals. And so we have to teach the barriers and blockers to positive communication. You can Google that right now and you'll come up with a whole list of them. We can help families become mindfully aware of these, to watch for these, and just try to do less of what doesn't work. If, communication is about the exchange of information. It's about the transfer of data, human data from one brain to another. And if we achieve defensiveness in our listener, we've lost them. We've lost them. And if somebody is doing something that has a negative effect on me, then I need to be able to let that person know, hopefully in a way that will get them to stop. And so I need them to hear it and not just, stick it to them and make a point and bash them over the head with what I'm trying to say. So communication, how we structure our sentences, and how we look and how we sound are so key. And I think that's important for us to be trauma informed, because a lot of us have a lot of work to do. We're around a lot of emotional contagion. We're around a lot of injured and sick people. And so we could sometimes forget how we look and sound as clinicians. And then parents certainly are not always mindful or aware that their affect and their tone are so key. And one of the things too, that we've got to help people think even about decibel levels. For instance, now, if I was doing a training with you guys, I could say, all right, let's do a role play. And I'm going to be the mean guy, and I'm going to come in, and I'm going to tell you ahead of time, I'm going to come in, I'm going to slam this door, and I'm going to, stomp right here, and I'm going to say some loud things, and I'm going to get into character. And you guys know I'm a social worker doing a role play, and you know that you're safe. But if I achieve a certain decibel level, I can change your heart rate and the functioning of your brain. Because if the brain hears a sound that's loud and aggressive, then the reactions override the cognitive awareness, and we become more reactive and less able to process information. So we shout at people, and sometimes they don't hear us because we shout. They react to us, and so there was something else that I was going to say about that. Oh, yeah. Another thing about tone and volume. The sound of our voice, the tone and volume actually hits our brain split seconds before the brain actually interprets the vocabulary, the language, the words. And so we're already getting an emotional reaction to the information before we've even perceived it. So that's why it's so important for us to, especially with problem solving or interventions, neutral, low, and slow. Because we have to be so mindful about that. Everybody else sees our face, and more than we see our own face. And we could have that resting what face, or that really concentrated face, or that blind guy looking off into the distance remembering something else and is actually burning a hole in somebody's face. We've got to remember how we look and sound and be mindful about that and practice it. I believe that we need to practice our communication skills a lot more. And I mean this for mental health professionals, for parents, foster, but also teachers in law enforcement. Medical professionals as well. A lot of doctors are brilliant, don't know how to talk to people, and so we really need to educate people on some of these fundamentals, because good information and good ability is lost if we're not able to convey it to the person that needs it. Let's go to the next one, and let me get a time check, Travis.
Jeremy, oh yes, I was just going to tell you that you have 15 minutes. It's 2:45.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for that. Okay. Yeah. So one of the things too that I feel, in school they did fire drills and tornado drills, and so and we hope that we never have to use them. Now they have active shooter drills. That hurts my heart. But the reason they do these things ahead of time is because we recognize that the brain's capacity for decision making and regulation and exploring options, complex thought, these are diminished with high stress and strong emotion. So we've got to have a plan, and we've got to practice, and then rehearse our plan, so we can make it somewhat instinctive. So when the time comes that we actually need these skills, we can actually use them. That they're familiar enough that we remember how to access these. And so working with our population is stressful. And so we've got to manage these emotions. Not taking care of our own stress, that's an ethical issue, because we're less functional. But also, when we do our coping skills, we're teaching kids something that's really important for them. So we can teach kids how to cope and to model those skills. And coping, there's two good reasons for coping. I feel like therapy doesn't spend enough time really practicing that. What are your coping skills? You got them, good, check the box. But no, what we've got to do is practice those skills and help them become instinctive. And again, practice, 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 and remind. And I think we have to sell it to them a little bit, persuade them on why this is something they need to do. And coping doesn't even usually work at first. It's rerouting the behavior and the focus. And over time, the repetition makes it more and more effective. But coping is for two reasons: relief, that's a good reason, and also to improve those functional capacities, because we're not good at the stuff we want to be good at if we're feeling bad. So keep going, Travis.
Next is psychological.
Okay. Well, I do specific stuff about this too. It is so important that we help the injured person forgive themselves for being injured. There comes with all that stigma, of being in service, or, people are often ashamed of how their trauma has affected them. And so it's hard. Recovery's hard. Life is hard. Education's hard, but certainly recovering from injuries and then doing all the other stuff we're supposed to do in life is really, really hard. And if you feel low, if you feel beat down, then that's kind of where your efforts are. Sometimes you don't even care to try. You don't even feel worthy of better things. And so we've got to help people. I go over the normal symptoms of trauma with kids, and I tell them this is what normal, healthy human beings experience when they have unhealthy, abnormally, stressful experiences. And it helps them understand that anybody can have a mental health diagnosis. Anybody who's too stressed out or too traumatized can struggle. And this one kid sat up. He said, "You mean I'm not bad? I'm not crazy? I'm not weak? I'm not wrong? I'm not all these things, he'd been told and come to believe about himself." And a light bulb was going off over his head. He was ready to forgive himself. He didn't want to be those stigmatized labels. But we've got to help them understand the symptoms of trauma and help them understand that trauma is an injury, but it's not an excuse. A lot of times people will hurt us and then they'll go away and they won't be in our life anymore. And trauma wasn't our fault, but it'll still be our outcome to change or deal with. And so we've got to help people forgive themselves for being injured in order to rise to the challenge of recovery. And I think psychological education is how we can do that. I do lots of psychological education. I say, the diagnosis will change again and again. DSM-5 is our edition now. Well, 6 and 7 as our words keep changing and our understanding of human problems keep changing. The three things that I say we keep addressing as the words change is trauma and chronic stress, unmet emotional needs, and dysfunctional norms, detrimental familiarities. Those are the three. I'll say those again: trauma and chronic stress, unmet emotional needs, and dysfunctional norms. Those are the things that we need to be targeting for kids and families. So, but psychological education is so key. But what's next?
Healing the lifestyle.
Yeah, healing the lifestyle. We have forgotten so many of our fundamentals. If we don't eat enough healthy food, if we don't get enough exercise, if we don't get enough sleep, we're supposed to feel bad. That's our body telling us. And so many of us have developed an expectation for an immediate gratification or an external answer or solution, and again, some medications are necessary for cholesterol, for anxiety, for depression, but we need to make sure we're meeting our body's needs first. I call these the ingredients to life. If you don't follow the ingredients in the recipe right, whatever you pull out of the oven is not going to taste very good. And it's our life. And so there's so many things. Nutrition, if we don't have enough green stuff, we're going to be depressed, and a lot of other factors. And hydration is so key. Sleep, without it, we get old fast. We deteriorate more rapidly. We get sick more often, and we just, our body deteriorates. So, and sleep, we know, is affected by trauma. So the traumatized person sometimes has to take some extra steps to really mind that sleep hygiene and give ourselves the chance for a quality night's sleep. And some, they say 7 to 9 hours is what you need. And some people say, I get 6. So, but if you need 8, well, I only missed out on 25% of my sleep. But the last cycle of sleep is the sleep that's most valuable and important and restorative to your body. And so if you take off the last 25% of your sleep, you've missed out on up to 60% of the restorative sleep that you need. So very, very important. And exercise, well, I'll just say this. Injured people have 3 layers of energy. Food is fuel. We know that. We need it. And now stress also creates the fight or flight response, and that also requires a lot of energy. Our body produces a little bit of cortisol and adrenaline with daily stressors. Now, life has stress, and then if you add a 3rd layer of stress that's post to a trauma, then there's going to be a lot of extra cortisol and adrenaline being produced, and our nervous system is going to be much, much more active. And so I will say this, and I'll say it strongly: if you don't exercise, you're going to be depressed and anxious, and you're supposed to be. You're supposed to feel bad if you're not giving your body what it needs. So when we exercise and use our large muscle groups, we take in more oxygen, which our body needs to relax. And also it produces dopamine, serotonin, other neurotransmitters that people go to the bottle for. So I'm not qualified to tell people to quit taking medication, but if I can get people pumped up enough about these self-care standards, a lot of times the need for their meds just kind of diminishes on its own. And of course, also we need to give ourselves stuff to look forward to. That's really important. But let's see if we can cover a couple more of these slides.
Maintaining health and sanity.
Yeah.
Like 6 minutes more.
Okay. Well, one thing that we saw with the pandemic, we had to rely more on technology, but we should still be the boss of how much technology kids are using. It's here to stay, and it's unrealistic and uncool to think that kids are not going to use this stuff. But more than 2 hours per day of social media, screen time, video gaming, it's showing some link to higher rates of depression, anxiety, social health, family, academic, because if we do one thing too much, we're not doing other stuff enough. And so it's really, really important for us to kind of help kids with their decision making regarding this, because kids' brains are not developed enough. And you can't give a kid a healthy choice and an unhealthy choice and just say, all right, choose. No, we've got to help regulate that. So keep going.
Next is identify, challenge, and change.
Yeah. So a lot of what I talk about is identify, challenge, and change. We won't get to a couple of these last slides on here, but we'll be glad to, like I said, email us if you want a copy of the presentation or whatever. But identify, challenge, and change. We've got to identify the experiences and traumas that have created our injuries. We have to be aware of those, and we have to be aware of how they have affected us. We've often developed negative ways of coping and communicating and dealing or not dealing with our problems. And so we have to recognize those injured behaviors that we started to develop, and we have to catch ourselves doing that. And that's when we have to insert new skill, insert new activity, insert new effort, and we have to do it over and over and over again. And we have to tell them it's not going to be miraculous. Do something different than what you used to do. It's going to feel awkward and uncomfortable. Repeating that over time does allow us to actually change our brain, though. Up to 3 weeks of repeating a new act, not doing the old activity, it starts a new neural pathway. And so the brain is just growing wild. It's constantly growing, but we can start to regulate and determine how our brain grows. And so I'm going to go to the very last slide now, so I'll just finish up on time. There's a couple that I'll miss. Yeah, rewiring for hope. And so we need to focus on the strength and resilience of our people. We are an injured state, but we are a state of survivors. And I'd like to see us start moving more of us into survivors to thrivers. And so we need to look to the examples of people that have been getting it done, that have overcome, and it helps remind other injured people that this is possible. Certainly I think we need to get more people on board with understanding this. And in the previous slide, I mentioned funders. We've got to get everybody on board, including the dollars and cents people, the people who make the decisions. We do the best that we can within the systems of care that we have. But emotion is contagious. And, we've been dealing with so much contagion and pandemic and all this stuff that we've been dealing with over the past couple of years. And I believe it's time for some emotional contagion for the positive. I believe that we should rewire for hope. I believe we can set Oklahoma on fire for good. And I'll ask you, John F. Kennedy said, we choose to do this, that, and the other, and we choose to do these things that are hard. Choose to do things not because they're easy, but because they're hard. Well, healing our state's going to be hard, but what choice do we have? I believe, people ask whether we think we can make a difference. I think that we are making a difference. I believe you're making a difference. I believe I'm making a difference. And we put our heads together, we're really doing something. So I want to thank you guys for bearing with us with our minimal technical difficulties today. And I just want to thank you, for your something, because, a lot of the problems we see in the world, people will acknowledge and say, yeah, but what are you going to do? Something. We all got to do something. And so I thank you guys. Please email us if you have questions, comments. You want to be on our email list. And we send out about 4 notifications per year about our events. So we will be glad. We won't inundate people with all kinds of junk spam. We don't do that. We don't appreciate that. But if you want to know about us or our presentations, we would love to share. If you want to join our organization, we want to partner with you. And we just thank you for all that you do. So
Thank you,
I'll
Jeremy.
turn it back over to Miss Susan.
Thank you, Jeremy. That was an excellent presentation. We learned a lot, and you've got me pumped up too to
Awesome.
go out and change ACE where I am. So thank you very much.
You're very
And,
welcome. And one of the things, if I may just plug, we were not able to get to the music presentation and the slide on that. So I will say we've got a presentation on music, and it's so fun. Music
Okay.
provides healing stimulation to the traumatized brain, and there's a lot more we can do with it. So
Okay,
so
we
I'd
will
love to share.
definitely be in touch with you, and as everything allows, have you come back and do other presentations. So thank you very much. Thank you
You're
for
very
all
welcome.
of you who have hung in there with us. We know that this is the last session of the day, so thank you for staying with us. And we do want to remind you to fill out your evaluation. The link will be posted there for you for the last time. And please give us your feedback. It's very valuable to the presenter and to us SPTHB organizers. So thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you at our next training summit next year. Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you, New View Healing Solutions.
Thanks again, guys. Y'all have a great day.
You too. Thank you so much. Idambi, before you close out, just allow a few minutes for people to complete the evaluation using the link before we shut down.
Sounds good. Yep.
Thank you.